Welcome to the Invero Show. Join the Invero team and our esteemed clients and partners as we demystify the complexities of Microsoft Cloud systems. We hope to help you accelerate your cloud journey and maximize the value of your investment with Microsoft. And now, on with the show.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Invero Show, this episode on our Spotlight Series on FinOps. We appreciate you joining us today, and we're excited to unpack some deep dives here into FinOps, and in particular today, talk about some FinOps hacks. Let's jump into our agenda here. Let's start off with some quick introductions, and then Craig's going to go through some FinOps Ready benchmarks. We're going to talk about the actual main event here of our 3 FinOps topics and the FinOps hacks. We're going to go through some customer emails and feedback, some customer examples, talk a little bit about how different companies are tackling FinOps overall. We'll have some time for some Q&A, and then we're going to actually do a giveaway here at the end. So let's go back to those introductions. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Ambrose. I'm part of the leadership team here at Invero and also the host of the event today. I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Craig and Stephanie. Craig is our CTO and our founder here at Invero, and Stephanie leads our licensing and FinOps practice overall. Thank you both so much for joining me today on the show. And with that, let's dive in here. Some of you may be familiar with our organization, Invero. Others may be less familiar. Today's not the day for a deep dive into all we do, but I do want to kind of ground why is it that Invero speaks about this topic, FinOps. And really, Invero's heritage comes from 2 places. First off would be being a consulting organization helping organizations within the cloud. So whether that's road mapping, advisory, migrations, automations, modernizing application sets, just really all about doing more within the cloud from a technology standpoint. We also happen to have a very strong licensing practice, which helps us understand all of the components on how to license, all the different programs, and both of those pillars, if you will, coming together allow us and have enabled us to become deep FinOps practitioners. And we're really excited to share that knowledge here today and create a community type discussion with fellow practitioners and just folks that are interested in FinOps overall. Before Craig dives in a little further, I just want to frame this quickly here in terms of everything we do around FinOps maps back to this framework here that's been created by an independent third-party organization called the FinOps Foundation. All of the large hyperscaler providers, Azure, AWS, GCP, et cetera, they all align themselves to this structure. I just want to kind of skim the high notes of this to frame it before I pass it to Craig to dive a little deeper. A key part of how FinOps Foundation pieces all this together is, as you can see, the area here of domains and capabilities. So there's 4 key domain areas that FinOps Foundation would look at and say, these are the core domains in terms of having a well-run FinOps practice. And then you can see under each of them are the specific capabilities. That's FinOps framework overall. Now I'm going to pass it to Craig, who's going to talk a little bit about industries and maturities and trends that we see. So Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Sean. That's a great introduction, great overview. As we've been maturing ourselves over the last year or so in FinOps and developing expertise in this space, we've learned a lot about where companies are at, how they are maturing, what they're focusing on, and we're, as Sean mentioned, highly leveraging the FinOps Foundation's framework and their maturity scale of crawl, walk, run. Through what we've learned in the industry, we're seeing where companies are at, and various companies are at different stages. We've actually developed our own FinOps benchmark index. And so this is just a summary of all the industries that we've looked at across our customers, where they're at today. And the blue bar there is they're 1.2, and this is on a scale of 0 to 5, sorry, crawl, walk, run across this 5-point scale. And so 1.2 being just above crawl, kind of in between crawl and walk, is where what we're seeing across our customers is where they're measured at. And how we measure this is through our FinOps Ready tool, and we'll talk about that at the very end of the presentation. But this benchmark gives companies a sense of where they're at today. So we have some customers that are below the industry average, some are above, and so they can kind of gauge where they're at. But then the more important one is the 2.9, where companies are planning to go. So they want to move from a 1.2 on average to a 2.9. What we're finding is we haven't found a single company that's wanting to go to a 5.0, like full on run, because that is probably unattainable. It's kind of, it's always evolving. This is like a journey that you go on with FinOps. So a 2.9 is really kind of on the border of run, and it's going to be getting you a lot of things. So if you're familiar with the FinOps Foundations framework, this will hopefully make sense to you of where you are on the scale. And by going through our FinOps Ready process, we can then help companies to mature by giving specific actionable recommendations on to get from, in this average case of 1.2 to get to a 2.9. These are the specific things you need to do across all the 22 domains and capabilities that the FinOps framework highlights. We're building this database of information from across our clients, and we're segmenting that information across industries, across company size, as well as by cloud spend. So this is the most recent benchmark data. So right now, companies of different sizes are in different levels. You can see the up to 2,500 employees are a little closer to the average, whereas the companies of the 25 to 100 to 5,000 are a little bit on the higher side. And you might expect that as companies get larger, they have more resources and more capabilities to be able to spend on FinOps, investing in FinOps. We've come across companies that have whole teams dedicated to the FinOps as their capabilities, and we'll get into one of those examples in the customer example that we're going to highlight later. So some companies are spending $1 million to $5 million that we've measured, some 5 to 10, and 10 to 15. We're obviously growing this data set as we run more and more companies through FinOps Ready. So our plan is to, in these regular sessions, we're going to be presenting our monthly benchmark updates. So if you can stay tuned and keep tuning into these, and we'll keep presenting this. And then as we have key findings, we're going to highlight those as well and what the data is telling us. But you can see kind of on average, this is where companies are at and where they're trying to strive for. Turn it back to you, Sean.
Thanks so much, Craig. All right, let's keep this going. This next part here is kind of a big part of the main event of why people are keen to join us today. This promise of, hey, let's unpack 3 FinOps hacks. So I'm gonna drop the slides here in a second. We're just gonna have a little kind of informal little panel discussion, if you will, with Steph and Craig to unpack resource tagging, reserved instances, savings plans, and setting up budget alerts. 3 really key areas of FinOps. On one hand, relatively straightforward to execute. On the other hand, it's all in the details. And so the more you know, the more you understand, the more you can navigate and leverage the complexity of these programs. So let's dive in here. I'll just drop the screen share for a moment, and let's just have a conversation here. Craig, why don't we start with you, and let's talk a bit about resource tagging. Let's start with, what is resource tagging? Let's just explain that for our audience.
For sure. And I just want to put a context of why we picked these 3 as well. These are three hacks that we kind of identify. If you're not doing any FinOps today, these are 3 things that you should be doing at a bare minimum. And if you are doing FinOps, maybe you're not doing one of these things to the walk or run level capability in terms of maturity. So these are the kind of base level where you're starting from. Do these things, and then you can add on more layers. Like FinOps can be daunting, and if you read the FinOps framework, there's so much there. You're going to get overwhelmed in terms of figuring out, where do I start? So that's ultimately where we wanted to talk today is, here, start with 3 quick wins, easy low-hanging fruit. So to answer your question, what is tagging? Resource tagging is part of the allocation phase of the or domain capability within the cost domain. Ultimately, what it is being able to allocate costs to some sort of value in the organization, and that value may be driven by a business unit or some shared services or what have you. But to be able to do that allocation, you need to be able to know and report on it. So tagging is essentially metadata that's attached to resources in the cloud. It's maybe you have a reporting database and the tags are associated there because maybe it's SaaS cloud spend that the SaaS provider doesn't support tagging, but all the hyperscalers support tagging in their cloud platforms. So it's essentially metadata, and you can add as many tags as you want. And I like to think of it analogous to most people have experienced Gmail at some point or used it, or similar mail platforms that use labeling. So tagging in the cloud is essentially like labeling in your mail. Like Outlook, you're literally dragging it to a folder, which is kind of the concept of a folder. But whereas in Gmail, it's a label. It's just a way of reporting and slicing that data. So it's actually saying, if you click on that label, you can now see all resources, or in the case of mail, all messages that have that label. So it's essentially behind the scenes doing a query and saying, show me all messages with this label. So tagging allows you to do a similar level of reporting when you're breaking out costs. So you're looking at your cost reporting. You get details of all the resources, pennies spent on these resources, thousands of dollars spent on other resources. How do you make sense of it all? By then having this metadata in the cost reports, that those tags give you that information to then slice and dice that cost spend. And if you think of pivot tables in Excel, or you can load it into Power BI and use different slicers and view the data by different different categories, different tags, that gives you the ability to then report on lower level granularity of that cloud spend.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Greg. So I think that really helps the audience understand what is resource tagging, and I think you've also touched there quite a bit on why is it so important. Part of what I'm hearing here is it may not directly reduce cost, but it's certainly going to provide visibility by departmental area, line of business, however those tags occurred,
Exactly.
which is going to create that visibility and likely drive more awareness and likely drive more of a cost-conscious culture, because now people understand, hey, wait a minute, this workload, this thing that I'm doing, it's impacting our cost this way,
Absolutely.
and before they may not have had that visibility.
That's true. Yes.
Do you have any hacks, if you will, on how would a company go about implementing tagging?
Start small, kind of the crawl, walk, run mentality, right? Don't overcomplicate things. Where you should start, though, is define what your taxonomy is, your tagging taxonomy. Figure out what are the types of tags that you want to define, and what information, try to standardize that information, what's going to go into those tags. If you leave it all to free-form text, there's data quality issues can creep in, because one person types, has a typo in their tag, and then now your reporting is off, and you have to do some manual cleanup on the back end when you're doing your reporting. So creating those standards, but that taxonomy can be start small and start simple. Again, don't overcomplicate, but the base level things, some good examples are, what's the business unit? What's the application that's associated with this? So, most people can think in terms of, this is their HR application, or this is our ERP, or whatever. That makes sense at that level. But if you want to get more granular than that, you can go down to the cost center or what have you. But again, you don't need to overcomplicate. Other good things are who created it. So you can go back and find out why it was created, and so tagging it. And some of these things can be automatically tagged when a resource is created. You know who created it, and you can actually attach that. What date it was created, so you can look for stale resources. This can, again, not just from a cost perspective, it can also help you with the cleanup and cost optimization down the road. You can identify a resource that's been sitting there and underutilized for 12 months. You can try to track down, is this actually still needed? Maybe it was a development test system that was spun up and forgotten about. You can then, once you've got that in place, you can actually assign policies that will enforce these tags. Now, whenever resources are added into the environment, it forces the individual, whoever, or through infrastructure as code, when that resource is going in, it needs these minimum level of tags. It doesn't have to be all the tags in the taxonomy, but it can be just what are the minimum ones that need to be assigned, so that that data is completed. And then you don't want to make sure you have a process of going back and cleaning up historical resources that exist that don't have tags. And that's going to be a recurring thing because there may be resources that do slip in that bypass policies for whatever reason and get in without tagging. So having a regular process to keep that in check is good as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Craig. How often would you recommend that an organization reviews their tagging structures and approaches?
Coming up with a taxonomy, I think probably annually reviewing overall. If you change it too often, it's going to be just chaotic because you then have to go back and update all the historical ones that exist. But doing at least a monthly or quarterly at bare minimum, I would recommend doing those reviews of any resources that have zero tags. So making sure that those are cleaned up because the last thing you want is your cost reporting is like you've got 2 or 3 applications that are very well defined, costs are well understood, and then you've got this other bucket that's like untagged resources, and that's like the biggest line item on your overall spend report. So being able to split that out, I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. Steph, we're gonna bring you into the conversation here, and for our audience again, when I introduced Steph, mentioned that she leads our licensing practice and our FinOps practice. Steph has spent her entire career in licensing, so she comes from that background of understanding all of the different levers and dials and adjustments and investments that an organization can make here to impact this and that kind of thing. So Steph, let's talk about reserved instances a little bit. Let's start off with kind of same question with Craig of what are reserved instances and savings plans? I hear those terms all the time, but I don't know if all of our audience would know exactly what those are. Can you explain them?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're part of the rate optimization capability in the optimize your cloud usage and cost domain. And they're really cost savings programs to try and get some of those compute costs down in your environment. So in exchange for committing to a virtual machine, for example, for a period of 1 year or 3 years, the costs end up being significantly reduced on the compute. For virtual machines, reservations will save you a 1 year in the probably 35 to 45% savings on that compute. And then on a 3 year, probably closer to that 60 to 65% savings. Depends on the version and the generation and the size, but essentially what you're doing is committing to that. For virtual machines, you're committing to that size and that type of virtual machine for 1 or 3 years. And then there are virtual machines there's reservations and savings plans that are available for more workloads than just virtual machines. So you can apply them to app services or Cosmos DBs. You can reserve SQL databases. All sorts of compute workloads would apply for this. Savings plans are a little bit different. They're actually a little bit more complicated to try and figure out what that commitment is going to be like, but they offer a little bit more flexibility. So for reservations, they have to be in the same region and you have to commit to a specific style. For savings plans, you end up just committing to a spend per hour, and it will pick up the most expensive resource that qualifies for a savings plan. So even if you buy it with an intention for virtual machines in mind, for example, it could absolutely pick up something more expensive and save you money in that regard. The Azure Advisor will give you some recommendations on what to commit, but the actual calculation, I think we could probably do an entire episode of this, just figuring out how to calculate savings plans, because it's basically on that spend per hour and it gets a little bit complicated.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. It's interesting listening. On one hand, sounds pretty straightforward. At the same time, the last word you used was complicated, right? It's for us as Invero, we meet lots of different organizations. Craig touched on different stages of maturity, all those kind of things. This to me is an area, number one, that is about real dollar savings, but maybe more to the point of it's an area where more often than not, when we meet clients, they're not getting this quite right. They usually have put some effort into it, but they haven't really nailed it. Why the struggle? Like what's the challenge there thematically?
Yeah, so there's a few things that definitely cause challenges in putting these in place. The first is trying to figure out the life expectancy of those workloads. So if you're not really sure, typically it's the IT team that is going to go in and buy these RIs or savings plans, but there has to be that collaboration with the engineers and the architects and the business owners to try and figure out what is the life expectancy of these servers or workloads. Can we commit to these long term? That the process of identifying these cost savings, trying to figure out what would apply, how much you're going to save, then working with the right stakeholders to get those in place can be time consuming and frustrating if you're not getting a lot of responses back, if you have to chase people down for things like that. And then actually buying them can be a little bit daunting as well. So going into the Azure portal, trying to figure out the right term, the right billing model, the right scope, all of that is it can be a little bit complicated.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely an area where I've noticed that having a guide, having a helping hand, having a sounding board has been really helpful for our clients. Because you're right, it's probably a little bit nerve-wracking of like, oh boy, what am I about to commit to here? And have I really thought about this from all angles? Um, how do you determine the correct amount to commit to? Because I think that's probably part of the concern that the cloud operator is going to have when they think about this.
Yeah, so understanding what you have in Azure is a good start. So just
Mm,
understanding what workloads are in place, what would actually qualify for those programs. You can utilize tools like Azure Advisor for identifying that. Other third-party tools will definitely also pick up these cost savings opportunities, or reaching out to your cloud solution provider. They'll usually also provide some assistance with that as well. So once you kind of identify these and figure out what the opportunities are, then you need to, for savings plans specifically, try and figure out what that hourly compute is going to be.
mm.
For things like that, I use the Azure Calculator. That's a helpful tool for figuring out some of those granulated costs. But also your own usage reporting. So you can download that usage report for a month and looking into things like, is that virtual machine been running 24/7? That's going to help you identify which workloads will qualify as well.
Yeah, and I think that touches on it. I think before we move on to the next hack, if you will, maybe we'll just close off here on kind of that next level hack here. And I think that's really talking a bit more about the utilization.
Yeah, so once you have these in place, once they're purchased,
Mm,
a strong recommendation I have is to put in an alert into your Azure environment just to report on the utilization. So you can pull reports showing how those reservations are being utilized, but a really simple, straightforward way to make sure that things are going in the right direction. You can set up an alert to show you if it will send you an email if the utilization of your reservation dips below a certain percentage. The default is 97% for 7 days. And then it'll just send you an email letting you know, hey, take a look, clean that up. You have the ability to exchange reservations if you have selected the wrong size, if you resize the VM, and there's no penalties for that. You also have the ability to cancel reservations. Savings plans do not allow for anything like that. So you have to be a little bit more careful when you're putting the savings plans in place. But for reservations, you can cancel them with a maximum of 50,000 USD per year. So definitely track those utilization rates. And you can even set up those alerts to go to the correct business owners or stakeholders if you don't want those alerts coming to you.
all right. Well, thanks for that, Steph. So we've unpacked resource tagging, we've unpacked reserved instances and savings plans, and a great segue. You talked a lot about alerts as it pertains to RIs and savings plans. Let's talk about budget alerts here. Craig, maybe back to you. What are budget alerts? Let's just talk about that a little bit here.
Yeah, I think the definition is in the term, right? It's alerting on your budget, but first you need to establish your budget. So that's the number one. You need to, what is that baseline? And in the early days of the cloud, the concept of resource sprawl was and it still is a real deal. But companies that didn't have a handle, didn't have the governance in place to make sure that their spend wasn't going out of control, they would literally wait till the end of the month and it's like, okay, what's our bill going to be? And it could be higher, it could be lower, and there's just no no certainty of where things are going to land. And that's obviously matured significantly since then. Now, there's first-party tools built into the cloud platforms that enable, establishing these alerts. And an example, in Azure, there's the cost management. You can set budget alerts, but again, you need to know what that budget is that you want to set it at, and then you can set thresholds. You're going to get, an actual alert when you're going to be within that threshold, and you can actually even establish, like kind of if the forecast is going to be exceeding where the budget is, you can establish alerts for that too. So ultimately, this is providing those guardrails so that you don't, wait 30 days, 31 days, see the bill, and you're like, oh my God, we blew our budget for the whole year in 1 month. And that has happened. We've seen, it was going back at, 5-10 years ago, had a client that literally had to call Microsoft and say, whoops, we made a mistake. And it was not a good situation because they didn't have the real-time visibility. So having these alerts, I think, is one of those, FinOps hacks, as we're calling them, that every company should have. So you at least know you're in check, or you get the alert, you're at 80% and you're 1 week into the month, and that could be a problem.
Yeah, for sure. And as you say, Craig, we see this with many clients where, everybody's got to navigate within budgets that they've built, right? And when there's things that have significant variances, it ends up putting a lot of strain on the business. And we see that often with clients where they say, hey, my cloud bill was X last month and now it's Y this month, and I didn't really anticipate that. I've got to find a way to have earlier visibility to that. It might be that new number is okay in terms of, the cloud is great value. There could be a lot of good reasons there, but it also still has to match up to the budget expectation that company built. And if there's that variance and lack of clarity, as I said, it's just going to put the business under some heavy strains. So I think we understand why that will be important to companies. Steph, maybe bring you in here a little bit. Do you have any suggestions, any hacks on how would organizations go about setting these things up?
Yeah, so one of my customers set up their budgets and their alerting so that they have alerts coming to them when their budget hits 25%, 50%, and 75%. That way they know the first week of the month, if they get that 25%, okay, things are going along well. So I think identifying what those thresholds are, how often you want to be alerted, what's going to be important for just that notification time frame. And then setting them up is actually pretty straightforward once you identify what your budget is. It's just a matter of going in and selecting who it's going to. It's all for Azure. It's done in the Azure cost management side of the portal. And then you just basically go in and select the thresholding and who should receive that alert. And it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Craig. These are three deep dives here into three great FinOps hacks of figuring out resource tagging, figuring out reserved instances and savings plans, which that one is the one that really will drive down the cost. The other two will help with visibility, which will help ultimately manage those costs. But they're all really, really important. But I'll say that the reserved instance and savings plans, if you get that right and you really figure out how to tune that, that's where you're really going to drive that cost efficiency. So fantastic discussions on the three FinOps hacks. Why don't we unpack some customer emails and feedbacks here a little bit? I'm going to pop the screen back up. Let's jump in. So we've got our first one here of this is an interesting one. What if the company says, look, we don't buy into this thing, FinOps. This is a distraction. I have no time for that. One of you want to take that one? Craig, do you want to take that? Or Steph?
Go ahead, Steph. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a common question, phrased a little differently of, well, how do I justify the value to my leadership? How do I get that executive buy-in? Because your FinOps practice is going to be a lot easier to get going if you do have that executive sponsor or that leadership buy-in. So if that's not in place right now, you can definitely get started a little bit slower, and you can start tracking some of the FinOps things that you get in place yourself. So if you're pretty passionate about cost savings and you want to take it upon yourself to be your internal FinOps practitioner, I would suggest starting with some of those cost optimizations. So identify those RIs and those savings plans. Take a look at your top spend category and really identify what those opportunities are. In addition to savings plans and RIs, there are pre-purchase plans. So really understanding what your biggest costs are and researching how to reduce those, and then track that and say it out loud to everybody how much you've saved. Really shout it out. Then put some of those guardrails in place. I find that cautionary tales are pretty helpful for understanding the value of things. So if you have tracked some of those disasters waiting to happen and prevented them, that is a great news story. So throw some of those alerts and budgets in there. And then if you have some like-minded individuals that are also interested, that are engineers, architects, business owners, some of those stakeholders that do want to get involved, definitely start maybe a little mini FinOps practice with a couple of people that are engaged with you, and then track that progress. All of these things that you're doing on your own, record it, and then use that to build your business case. Here's all of the money you've saved. Here's all of the good that you've been doing with these FinOps principles. And that should make it a lot easier to then present all of that to leadership and get some buy-in.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I think that's great. I think every business faces resource constraints, right? Everybody's busy, everybody's working hard, and we all only get the same amount of hours in a week, our work hours and our total life hours, and we're trying to balance all that. And it's difficult sometimes to say, hey, I'm going to carve out, whether it's 2 hours a week or it's 12 hours a week, I'm going to carve that out to go do this. That comes at a sacrifice because there's something else that you were probably going to be doing. And so I really like your guidance here of find some quick wins. Go look at where there's the most money spent. Dollars savings are certainly going to drive the attention. Certainly the executive stakeholders go, whoa, wait a minute here. Okay, I want you to go spend that time and let's become a FinOps practitioner and invest more in that because they'll start to see that value. So some really good guidance there. Thanks, Steph. Let's go to the next question, Craig. I think this one's more for you here. You talked earlier about FinOps Ready benchmarks. Like how are those collected and how are they used?
For sure. So we've got we'll present it in a second here about a FinOps Ready maturity assessment, and that's what we use to create this benchmark. We aggregate all the data across all of the customers that we run through this. It's all anonymized, so we're not using customers' names and kind of including that in the benchmark. But we aggregate it and then we slice and dice that based on different demographics. So it could be industry, company size, cloud spend, and over time, we're going to be just evolving this because there's more and more insights, even going down to the domain and capability level, looking at, okay, certain industries are lagging behind in one of the capabilities, for example, and we can start digging into with those customers why that might be, and surface those insights at a macro level across all industries, and share that with the community here. And that's the goal of this Spotlight on FinOps, and overall our benchmark is to share publicly where the industry is at, where the multiple industries are at. And where FinOps maturity is, and because this is not you implement FinOps maturity and you say, okay, we're done, wipe your hands. It's an ongoing investment. And as Steph touched on in the last question there, being able to show that value over time, there's going to be continued investment into FinOps because it does require care and feeding, and it's not just okay, yeah, we check the box, we did FinOps. It needs that ongoing because management, more because the environment in the cloud is constantly changing. It's not static. So we use this data to provide insights for the community here, and that's ultimately how we collect it and then how we use it. But it's not we're not singling out individual companies. It's all, like I say, anonymized across the industries.
Yeah, some good PII redaction there of the information that shouldn't be shared, but all of the trends certainly are being shared. And in a moment, we're going to unpack that a little bit of how we go about looking at those at that relative stage of maturity and mapping it back to that framework, Craig, that you described of crawl, walk, run. Where are they at? And and where do they want to be, and understanding that going further could very well just create like a law of diminishing return. Like there are
Yeah.
ways, there are every business based on industry, company size, and cloud spend may have their own viewpoints of their desired level of maturity, and then they might go, wait a minute here, if I go beyond a 3.5, while that would be great, it might be, I'm putting in, for every 1 hour effort, I'm only saving a quarter hour back, and it's no longer viable to do that. So there's that sweet spot for every business, and there's so many different situations, which is where that maturity assessment comes in. So before we unpack that a little bit, just going to flash us up on the screen of, we just unpacked some customer email questions, and we encourage these, and we'll answer you offline, and we'll also answer this and answer future ones in future upcoming episodes of our FinOps Spotlight series here, or our Spotlight series on FinOps. So why don't we dive in? Before we unpack the maturity assessment, let's go through a couple customer examples that we've got here of where they've been looking to further mature their FinOps practice and capabilities and the associated benefits with that. So let's start off here with a large global company.
Yeah, so we came across this company that is spending $1 billion a year in the cloud, obviously for privacy reasons. We're not mentioning the company name, but this is an individual at the organization that I spoke to directly. And this is obviously a very large global company that has many subsidiaries. So it's a very complex organization, obviously many different IT departments across the board, but they had a centralized FinOps team. So they recognized the value in having that, making that investment and having that visibility and developing standards of FinOps governance and maturity across all of their subsidiaries and all the companies. So they were challenged, as Steph talked about earlier, the idea of, if you're not implementing RIs and savings plans, you're missing out on some big opportunities of savings. But they, as a company, before they established this formalized FinOps team, they were really hesitant, even though they had hundreds of thousands of virtual machines and compute workloads that would have benefited from RIs. They just could not guarantee that they were needing those workloads in place for more than 12 months or more than 36 months. So they were hesitant to bite off and committing to RIs or savings plans. So what they did is they did something that I thought was very unique and hadn't come across this before, but they manage that risk across all of their workloads by just making RI purchases on a weekly basis. So they commit to 1 year, they don't do the 3 years, and they call them micro RI commitments, which I think is very unique, and that's why I wanted to share it with the FinOps community here, because this is something that maybe another large organization may see some value in. So essentially what they did was every week they bought at least one set of RIs because it was replacing a previous one. So obviously it was bought 52 weeks prior. So there's one rolling off or multiple RI commitments rolling off. And they're going to look at and rationalize, okay, do we have enough of these SKUs that are going to benefit? If so, we will, recommit to that same RI family or what have you. Or maybe it's an opportunity to switch to another family. So they do that reevaluation, resizing, and also as part of that, they're going back to the workloads and maybe and analyzing, is there a new SKU that's come out in the last year that maybe was faster, more efficient, and cheaper? So, and that happens all the time in the cloud. There's always new SKUs coming out. So that's an opportunity to optimize the workload as well in that on a weekly basis. So if you think of a $1 billion spend plus cloud environment, there's a lot of workloads to look at. So this helps them just on a weekly basis, very focused. Okay, we got these, call it 1,000 compute workloads that are expiring next week. Or they're probably looking more than like a month in advance before they expire. But then are they going to rationalize those, or what are they going to do? And so they're prepared when that week expiry comes up. They're ready to know what they're renewing. So I love this idea of a micro RI commitment. I think it was a unique solution to a very complex problem.
Yeah, no kidding. Really, really smart way to do that. Just as you're talking about, I'm thinking of $1 billion cloud spend, about $800 million a month. If you shave 10% off that, it's $80 million a month of savings. Wow, yeah, that's worth doing. That's worth putting some effort into, for sure. All right, let's move on from this example and just talk briefly here about what other companies are doing. And Steph, why don't we have you talk a bit about this of what you're seeing companies do for FinOps?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our customers are some of the smaller cloud spend customers where just getting into keeping an eye on their FinOps maturity and some of their FinOps principles is it's kind of more of a starting point. But yeah, following that framework and getting some of these initial things in place, we're seeing some great cost savings across the board. I mean, I'm sure Microsoft is not overly thrilled with this whole model of the ACR going down, but what a great way to get started for some of these customers with FinOps is with some of these quick wins. So yeah, getting our eyes in place, definitely seeing a lot of that going on. And then really just paying attention to their maturity and to some of those goals. So once we get through that initial cost savings, really taking a look at how we can improve processes and starting to really operationalize and document these processes is really the next step in maturity for a lot of these organizations. So we're seeing a lot more of that, which is great.
Yeah, and to your point, seeing it across multiple industries and multiple sizes of organizations. If you're spending $100 a month in the public cloud, well, it's not really all that material, but that number starts to cream up into the thousands and tens of thousands, and even into the hundreds of thousands or more. It becomes very imperative to look at this and be able to gain some mastery here around FinOps. So great conversation on these two. I think we're going to unpack here the FinOps maturity assessment and how we go about that. But before we go into the structure of the assessment itself, Craig, maybe you want to just come back to this framework here, tee up the framework, and then we'll look at how we map that back into how we think about the maturity assessment itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, so as Sean put on the screen previously, this FinOps Foundation framework is what we follow. In the bottom right corner, the maturity model there, crawl, walk, run. If you break down and unpack the framework, which is all publicly available information, finops.org, go in there, you can look into each of the 22 capability areas and see what it means to be a crawl stage, what it means to be a walk stage, and what it means to be a run stage. Again, 22 times 3 different stages. How do you know where you are today and where you need to go? Ultimately, as we've said before, it's start small, don't try to bite it all off, tackle one bit at a time. But so we've developed this FinOps Ready we talked about earlier as a solution to help companies assess where they are today, and that's your current state, and then where you want to go. So if you think back to that benchmark, it's where companies are at today, that 1.2, and where they want to go at 2.6 or 3.6. That's ultimately the gap. So where you are today across all 22 domains and where you want to go, we then analyze that gap and provide actionable recommendations. We distill this all down into a dashboard that gives you specific rating of where you are today and where you're going across all 22 domains and capabilities, so that you can identify where you want to go. So like the example here, you can see like anomaly management, this example data set, that customer wants to be like way on the upper end. They want to be really high on anomaly management, but they're only just above a 1 today. Whereas on, say, something else like unit economics, they're targeting a little bit of a lower number. But we aggregate this all up, and there's a lot of weighting in this tool behind the scenes that we leverage to calculate these values, and ultimately this goes into our tool and provides you the numerical value. So you can see in the top left there where they're at, or crawl, walk, run. 1.2 is current, and you can see that lines up with about where the industry benchmark is. And then on the target rating, in this case is a 4.0, where does that line up with the benchmark? So are you striving to be above the benchmark or below? And it gives the clients a guide on where they they want to, where they should be making investments. If they're lagging behind, maybe they want to overinvest in the upfront. But if they're striving to be above the industry benchmark, maybe they can taper that back when they do a future assessment and say reassess where they're at. So we take this. This is again just the dashboard, and then we provide a report, which is typically about 60 pages in length. Here's an example of the table of contents. You can see we cover each of the 22 domains and capabilities, and for each of those, we then provide a specific description of the current state, what the recommendations are to achieve the desired end state, action items. Like these are things that you can start doing today and then execute on them in order to mature your environment. And then ultimately summarizing what are the benefits. And this is across 22 domains. So this is example here on screen is just for one of those 22 domains. And then we distill this down into the top 10. So we help you prioritize where you should focus in the near term. By doing that, it's not overwhelming. You got the 60-page report figuring out where do I start. We give you that top 10 and we rank them and say, okay, you start here, move down to here, and you can work on some of these in parallel. But this helps customers really mature over time. And it is, like I say, it's not a checkbox. It's not like we are now mature. You're moving in a direction. And so developing this roadmap helps. And then we recommend doing these FinOps ready assessments at least once a year so you can track your progress over time, measure where you are today, and then new recommendations come out. So as we do these assessments, we figure out where you're currently at, where you're trying to get to, and then the gaps slowly shrinking. And as a result, the number of recommendations will reduce as well. So that's FinOps Ready in a nutshell. So Sean, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, the FinOps Ready maturity assessment is so helpful for organizations. You think about that scenario, maybe a CFO goes and asks the CIO, how are we doing with our cloud spend? I've heard about this thing, FinOps. Are we mature? Like how would you answer that, right? How do you quantify that versus just being kind of shooting from the hip and going, well, we think we're doing pretty good. And just kind of rambling off some things. This is really going to put that data behind that desire of that question of, well, how mature are we? And then the question that would probably follow it is, well, how mature should we be? So now You've got clarity of where are we at today? Where do we desire to get to? And then some real clarity of what's the roadmap? What would you go do? And what are the priority things you would do? And then what are the things that you might tackle a little bit later on? Really, really, really straightforward. Craig, maybe just before we wrap up, what's the investment of time that a client would? Time is precious, right? So someone says, "Yeah, I want to do this." The cost is relatively insignificant. The time's probably the bigger question. How much time should a client think about to prepare to go through this assessment?
That's a great question. So no preparations required. What we do is we put clients through a workshop first, and usually this is just a starting point. It's a 1 hour workshop, and or I think it's 2 hours, sorry. And we go through a baseline of where companies are at today. So the first half an hour of that workshop is identifying just a base set of terms, make sure everybody's on the same page. They understand what is FinOps, start with the basics, because maybe not everybody is that familiar with it. And then we ease into, okay, what are you doing today? And that's where the workshop kind of just takes on more of an interactive discussion process, and we learn about the client's current state of FinOps. And that we then feed that information into our report. But then ultimately, after that, there's a questionnaire that the client goes through, and that takes anywhere from 2 to 4 hours, depending on how much discussion needs to happen. We do recommend individuals not just running the assessment themselves, rather bring in all the stakeholders and talk through each thing. Because if you have just one person's opinion of what you're doing, you may miss some key discussion points. So having an internal discussion, and it could be facilitated by Invero as well. That is an option that we do offer clients. But typically our clients are running through this questionnaire themselves, and they choose where they're at today, where they're going, And then that informs our quantified results, so we can give you a numerical value, and then we ultimately write up our report. Our turnaround time is, we guarantee 3 days after completing that questionnaire that we will get the report out. So time commitment overall on the client side is really about 4 to 6 hours max, to end to end.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Craig. So in summary, invest 4 to 6 hours, learn a whole bunch more about FinOps, and you'll understand that maturity of where you're at today, where you desire to get to, and how it is that you go about that. Probably a pretty good return on time invested, I would think. Okay, so for our audience, folks that are say, hey, I want to learn more about this, reach out to any of us. We're more than happy. We love chatting about this stuff. But if you just want to say, I just want to look online and see what you got, we got a QR code there, or our website here. We'll get you there. So thank you all for your time. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, Craig, for the great discussion. Pleasure as always. And to our audience, thank you. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.